All reset and technique right here. Sample to Vortic for the game. And Madison Magic has returned to Bree Stevens Field.
Johnson go to Sadok, marked by Brownlee. 5 seconds, Tanner Johnson go, floats into the end zone. It's a battle at the buzzer, and you better believe Jeff Babbitt lives for the moment. He's got it with 4 seconds to go. There is still time, at least there was a second ago on the clock. And with a roller pull, knocked down. Jack Williams looks at the clock, sends the backhand into the wind. Looks like it's going to be short. Boston needs a Nest deflection, and Cable pulls it down, and Boston is moving on. The Glory have defeated the reigning champions.
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass. I'm Adam Ruffner. That is Cameron Brock. We apologize for the brief hiatus from the show, but we are back in a big way and better than ever. Huge first round playoff news, big recap time, starting with the headline from the last weekend. Babbitt and Boston getting the best of the two-time reigning champions from New York. Boston coming out with the 19-18 win over the Empire, ending what appears to be their dynasty. New York with 3 of the last 4 titles in this league, but eliminated in the first round of the playoffs. Madison, in their return after 6 years away from the postseason, getting a double overtime sudden death win against their rivals and border battle companions in the Chicago Union. 18-17 in the Central Division first round matchup. Seattle and Carolina also claiming victories. Cameron, this chaos season continues to live up to its billing. Every single week, it feels like there are results and just complications and wrinkles to the general storyline that it feels like downright at times, and people keep talking about it, are almost scripted.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't have written a better ending to the New York-Boston game if you want to talk about scripting. MVP Jeff Babbitt, scoring a goal almost with no time left. I think there was maybe under a second. I can't remember if they just called it, but and against his former team, right? The team that until just about a month before the season, we thought he was still going to be playing with. And you know what? This was probably the best opening round of games we've had in the playoffs, where really in all 4 divisions, when the fourth quarter started, all of these games were competitive. You couldn't turn away before that fourth quarter started because they were all within, a couple goals of each other, if not, straight up tied going into that last quarter. And it just made for some fantastic finishes and some fantastic fourth quarters, or, in the case of one game, a fantastic double overtime. So absolutely amazing first round of the playoffs. If this is a sign of things to come for the rest of the playoffs, we are in for a completely wild ride the next, 3 or 4 weeks.
Well, the perspective, favorites over the last 2 seasons plus and the New York Empire are completely out of the field. There are just 8 teams remaining, and let's just briefly go through what those divisional championship matchups will look like. In the East Division, you've got Boston at DC. In the Central, Madison at Minnesota. In the West, Seattle at Salt Lake. All of those taking place on August 10th. And then in the South Division, you've got Carolina at Atlanta on Friday, August 9th. Those will take place in just under 2 weeks from now. There will be a bye week in between this first round set of games and the divisional championship round, But the excitement continues. Again, just 8 teams remaining. And I feel like we've just got to launch into Boston versus New York. I mean, we knew going into this game, there were a ton of stakes on the line. As you kind of outlined, the reigning MVP and Jeff Babbitt played there for 6+ seasons, won 3 different titles with the Empire. did not re-sign with them before this season, signed with Boston on April 1st in a move that many people interpreted as a straight up April Fool's joke. And it took a couple of days of just letting it settle for that reality to even kick in. I mean, this was 26 days before the start of the entire season on April 27th. That's when the last season's MVP re-signed with a divisional rival. You know, you talk about big time additions. There's no bigger one than that. We much ballyhooed and hyped Pavel Giannis moving from Chicago to LA before the 2023 season. I feel like this Babbitt one, and we've talked about it on this show and extensively throughout the season and coverage, this was even bigger. And yet it has now exceeded the greatest expectations. I mean, if you were going to make an offseason move, it would be adding an MVP and then utilizing that player to take down and dethrone the reigning champions. And that's exactly what Boston did on Saturday at midday at home. They come away with that last second buzzer beater, a prayer from Tanner Johnson-Go into the end zone. Orion Cable kind of seals out the rest of the defenders, and Jeff Babbitt does one of the more arabesque, acrobatic movements in his buzzer beater glory sort of phase. You know, he's one of the best buzzer beater athletes. Let's not even parse words here. He's the best buzzer beater athlete in this league, in this sport, period. And he did a move that I feel like I haven't seen him do, which is not use his physicality, use his timing almost entirely, and kind of like shadow step around several different large-bodied adult humans and just make the play at the most opportune time in the biggest game of the entire season that has more emotionality and more stakes riding on it than I feel like almost any matchup has in the past several seasons. And he just he reels it in. He runs off the field like a madman, absolutely shouting his face off. And this moment has just been playing in my head over and over. He gets that goal. He then runs out about 10 yards outside the end zone, and he just points at the opposite end zone line for New York, his former team, to go walk back to for what is going to be their final point of not only in the season, but prospectively their dynasty right now.
Yeah,
Like
it's
what other than just describing it, I don't have words for that. Like, there's just the reality of, like, he went and did all that.
And you're right about the catch, too, because what we're used to seeing is him kind of just being kind of bigger and stronger and then going up. And the thing that's always so impressive about the way he attacks a disc at the end of his quarter situations is so often he goes up and gets it with two hands because he's just able to create so much space for himself. And he's so explosive from a standstill in ways that a lot of people aren't. Like, I can tell you for me personally, like at my absolute apex of like the highest I could ever jump, I was able to grab a disc at about 11 and a half feet. But that was, I needed to generate momentum. And Jeff Babbitt feels like he can go do that with not even taking a step. And it's what's made him so impressive in these situations. But this was the best angle. It was kind of like the field level camera I saw that was in the opposite corner, I think is where it was being shot from. You see this, like all of these bodies, and then there's just like this pathway in between bodies. And he somehow, as a guy as big as he is, makes himself skinny to like get through that lane to go and get the disc. And it was just so unlike what we're used to, where he is just like straight up bodying people and going up and like almost like the Hulk, just jumping out of a group of bodies and just being bigger and stronger and more athletic. And this was a completely different type of athleticism, almost less like the Hulk and more like a ballet dancer, like just finding the right spot and getting the right footwork to get through this small space. And I do need to shout out, you mentioned it, Orion Cable did such a good job taking up so many of those bodies.
He Hodored that situation.
I mean, it
he
literally
sealed
was
out like 3 different New York bigs.
It literally looked like just a giant just playing with like little men who just don't belong. Like it was almost comical how well he was just able to body out half of the New York Empire D line at that point. But it was really I mean, and that's not even mentioning the fact that the rest of the game, he scored 3 other goals, had a block, he was tied with Orion Cable and Jack Williams for highest and plus minus, which, we would expect nothing else than in a big game for Jeff Babbitt, as he does in most games, whether they're big or not, to be kind of the just leader with his play on the field, like no matter what situation his team is in. And for him to, it's not just him, right? But like he is obviously the focal point of what they've done this year to be successful, to host, for the first time, host a playoff game and to get their first playoff win, and to do it against a team that, to start off the season, won their 31st straight game. I mean, it is extremely impressive, not just what Jeff Babbitt has done, but what this franchise has been able to do this year.
Wanted to take a moment to talk about Orion Cable because I felt like that was his best game I've seen as a pro. He had 335 receiving yards, led the entire game with 6 goals, and to your point, just had kind of the teammate help support moment of the entire match against New York. But I struggle because I feel like I could go for an hour and a half about what Babbitt has done this season. Because let's just start with this. In 3 games against a reigning champion team, to your point, that came into this season carrying a 31-game winning streak, setting a UFA record, league record, Babbitt doesn't have a turnover in 3 games against his former team this year. He's 2-1 against them. They lost 5 games now in 2024. That's more than they've lost over the last 5 seasons combined. There's just, again, I kind of mentioned it when we were even introing this segment. There's a lack of kind of words or expressions other than just stating the facts of what he's kind of accomplishing at this point. This is somebody who has already won 3 titles. He then switched teams. He's now as good of a season as Brett Halsmeyer is having, as good of a campaign as Cole Jurek is having with DC. There's some other, I think, worthy nominations for MVP this year. Lucas Ambrose is doing some fantastic stuff in Seattle. We'll get to that later in this episode. How do you look at what Jeff Babbitt just did to the reigning champions and have any other thought about a more impactful player in this league? And I was talking about this with somebody else over the weekend. This is somebody who doesn't even attempt passes over 20 yards at this point. All he does is just complete a pass and then move back into an impactful position on the field. He's Shaq. We don't even need to see a jump shot from him anymore to understand the kind of gravity that he can have at any individual moment, whether it's making a goal-scoring play, whether it's coming up with a block, whether it's even kind of repositioning on the field. I mean, to kind of what I was starting this thought with, I just struggle to come up with words to describe what he's doing in this sport, given that it's not reliant on any kind of throwing dimension. But he's undeniably the most important player on the field every single time he takes a point.
Yeah, I have been critical of the Boston offense, and I will continue to be a little bit critical of it because there are times where it just looks like they're just working way too hard.
And again,
but here's the thing. It seems like
I just want to add to that. They added half of this team with 3 weeks to go before the season. It's a little turgid because that's kind of understandable.
Sort of. I feel like in the off season I want to do a kind of a short video, because it's a system. I've noticed it's a systems thing, not a players thing. because it's like
Fair.
there's like a consistent. Anyways, to get away from that, it actually like it kind of makes it even more impressive for me that I feel like their system is really just kind of barbaric in the way we play Ultimate today, and like the way we understand how you can work offenses, but they're still making it work because, in large part, because Jeff Babbitt takes so much of the oxygen on the field. Like you're kind of always worried that he might beat you deep, and what he does so well is he'll just accept the under, or accept just kind of coming even with the handlers and just getting the disc, and like you said, he just kind of completes the next pass. It's not a big gainer, and half the time he's losing yards or not, or just kind of going flat even. But what it does is it keeps the possession alive, right? Like it's like you can always count on him to get open in a space where they can complete the next pass, so that the possession just stays alive. And at the end of the day, if the offense is kind of ugly and kind of slow and kind of feels like it's getting stuck over and over again, but it's staying just enough unstuck that they're not turning the disc over, then obviously at the end of that, eventually you score, right? Like if you're not turning it over. And they are one of the lower scoring teams in the league, because they do kind of struggle to move the disc with consistency and down the field. But what they do is they continue to find like these reset opportunities. And what we saw in this game actually is when New York kind of made the run and took their lead, and it looked like all the early momentum from Boston completely flipped in New York's favor. We saw that they weren't able to move the disc with like any amount of consistency. And what was really happening a lot is it seemed like Ben Sadok was getting kind of like stuck on sidelines, whether he would, or sometimes he would be in the recess position, and they're kind of getting stuck there and they're trying to get the disc around, but they don't really have a lot of great throwing angles. They've kind of pinned themselves on the sideline. And there was a run there where they just had a couple of really rough possessions, but there just kind of felt like there was this inevitability the whole time as I was watching. Like, yeah, New York's making a run. Yeah, New York's got a couple goal lead now, but it just kind of felt like Jeff Babbitt was just going to happen. And, not to take anything away from his teammates, right? But like, again, he's kind of the focal point, and other guys had great games and did some great things, but it just kind of felt like, I felt like Babbitt was just going to find a way to like will them to victory. And that's kind of how it felt like it happened in the end. Like he just wasn't going to let them lose that game.
Yeah, and I don't think you're incorrect in assessing that. I will say that I think we need to color it out a bit more, because I was so impressed with the top-down team effort from Boston and their just general kind of strategic approach to the game. It felt like they kind of broke New York over the yoke of their coverage and what they were attempting to do to the Empire offense throughout that entire matchup.
Yeah.
Boston gets 12 blocks. They're 7 of 8 on defensive break opportunities against the reigning champs. Like they just had a very good game plan for approaching New York. And I don't disagree at all with your assessment that it felt like there is an inevitability to having Babbitt be the determining factor. But I think that that's an expression of how good Boston approached this Empire matchup. Like, and we can almost talk about it a little bit in the inverse of how I thought maybe New York sort of hamstrung themselves in a couple of different areas. But I just thought it was one of the best ways in which Boston could have approached this. I thought the most daunting first round matchup you could possibly have, right?
Yeah.
Like they're 8-4, but it's freaking New York. Like,
Yeah.
do we even really need to sell it at this point? Like, if you were ever to not want a first round home game against a team, it's the New York Empire and the way that they've been playing for the past month. And Boston just sort of defanged them. Like, New York was 3 of 9 on Hucks again. They had no explosiveness against this Glory defense. They just could not get any kind of real deep ability or vertical stretching. They had one Huck in the first half that relied on Ben Yacht boxing out Gus Halflin. And other than that, it was Jack Williams getting a couple of jump balls, and that was it, as far as what New York could strike deep on. And it's just such a contrast point to what they were doing against DC in the East Division title game in 2023, where it was just a rainmaker show to Ben Yot in deep space. There was an anemicness to this New York attack that I both feel like is indicative of what we've seen at various points this season, but I also think is a credit to what Boston brought. We talk about the efforts outside of what Jeff Babbitt just did, but Rocco Linehan getting an absolutely monstrous sky block in the second point of the game. Boston getting a couple breaks early, taking that first quarter lead, letting New York know you can't just run down on us. Like, one of the things that we've talked about, particularly in the playoffs for the past 2 seasons, is the way that the Empire just jump on teams, especially in bigger matchups almost. Like at championship weekend in 2022 and 2023, New York would just kind of jump down your throat. And in this matchup, Boston completely inverted that. They showed out that they were going to play make at the beginning of this game, that they had come with an intensity and a physicality that was going to meet the reigning champs, fist to fist. Like, I just can't kind of get over how mentally prepared and locked in this Glory team was.
I want to shout out Simon Carapella too. His continued evolution. So he didn't, he was the guy pre-Babbitt. Like, he was their goal scorer, right? Like, he was their receiver, kind of like their receiver one downfield.
He was like Jung to me. Yeah. Like, his ability to just get separation in kind of any level of the field, wherever you needed him. It was just like, yeah, put him in a box, let him get open one-on-one. He'll do it.
His evolution as a thrower, though, like, he finished this game with no goals. Preach. But he had 4 assists in this game, and like, outside of the assists, even like, just his ability to find and make the right throw, and he did it from different distances in this game too. It wasn't like they were all just like these 5, 10, 15-yard throws. Like, his ability to continue as a thrower was great. Like, Tyler Chan continues to me to be like this guy that I feel like
I was waiting for the Chan thing, because I feel like outside of the Babbitt goal before the buzzer with 4 seconds left in regulation, the Tyler Chan block earlier in the fourth quarter was the most pivotal moment in the entire game.
Well, and he's a guy that I feel like he could go somewhere and be a receiver one. Like, he's got incredible speed. He seems to win his matchup with a lot of consistency. But, this is the thing that happens when you're on a team with really good players, right? Like, the wealth kind of gets spread a little bit more, and like, then you kind of have your true apex predator that kind of rises to the top, and like a Jeff Babbitt, right? Like, but some of these other guys, they kind of fly under the radar because maybe they're not putting up the numbers of these other guys. But like, Tyler Chan's ability to stretch deep with his speed and just threaten constantly in that area, I think, is something that's been really good all season. I sometimes I actually wish I would just see more of him getting involved more. Like, but you already shout out Rocco Linehan. He played an awesome game. Like, I remember he was a guy when he was in Minnesota that was always like, I thought was a really good player, and he really put that on full display in this game, and he was a big part of what happened. I want to touch on what you said about them going 7 of 8 on break opportunities, though, because really kind of sneakily, like, this kind of snuck up on me until I took a look at it at the end of the season. If you want to be critical of something about this New York team this year, and I've heaped a lot of praise in them, because they did have to like overcome a lot of like changes in a short period of time leading up to the start of the season, right? Like, up until about a month before the season, we thought that Jeff Babbitt and Ryan Osgar were going to be on this team, the 2 most recent MVPs. And then, in the span of a week, they're both gone. And then, also Katz is gone. Like, it just like, that was a lot of things to have to adjust to in a very short period of time. And I thought after the first couple games, they really did figure out the adjustments they needed to make to get back to being a very good team. But one thing that they never did was their O-line, and this might shock some people when I say this, they finished with giving up nearly 59% conversion to opposing D lines. And if you want me to put that in context, like, okay, well, how bad is that? It is the 7th worst conversion percentage given up in league history. This O-line for New York could not win the disc back all season. If you want to extrapolate that even a little bit more, in games against playoff teams during the regular season, opponents broke on 75% of their opportunities. They gave up 75% D-line conversion percentage. And some people might be saying, well, yeah, you take Jeff Babbitt off of that O-line, who is one of the best defenders in the league. That makes sense. But the thing is, like, this includes their worst that they'd ever had before this was 43.4%. And this was in 2017. There was no Jeff Babbitt on that O-line. You know, they're a full 16% worse almost. Or sorry, about 15.5% worse. I mean, they just couldn't win the disc back. And you saw it in this game. The only turnover Boston's D-line had wasn't even on defensive play. It was literally a turfed disc to an open receiver. It wasn't even New York doing anything. In their last regular season game when they DC handled them pretty well, it was the same thing. I think DC converted on like all but 2 break opportunities. And that's what really did this Empire team in. In all of their losses, their O-line was just not able to get the disc back after they turned it over. And it doesn't seem like there was any like strategic thing or even a player loss thing that really caused this. It was actually kind of really baffling to see that they went from a team that was consistently pretty good in that area to one of the worst in league history. And I don't really know. Like, I don't have a stat or a thing to like tell you why that was, other than they just couldn't do it.
So to your point, in the last 2 games against the Empire, opponents have converted 16 of 17 break opportunities DC and Boston have together against the reigning champions. And to your other point about just the lack of pressure that New York has been applying on the defensive side of the disc, this season in 13 games, they had 2 performances with 10 or more blocks. In 2023, they had 12 such games in 15 matchups. In 2022, also in 15 games, they had 9 performances where they exceeded double-digit block totals. There has just been a discernible lack of pressure executed both on the defensive side and as well what you're talking about in transition when they turn it over on offense. You know, this was a New York team that was historically great as far as offensive success rate when they had all their pieces. And certainly losing a couple of those has manifested in some lower totals as far as being able to earn the disc in offensive possessions. But it doesn't really explain the complete just dissolution of kind of any kind of transition coverage that they can employ against these other D lines.
Yeah, it gets even worse if you their first game against Montreal only went 5 of 15, so they only converted 33%, which, like, that's good, obviously. If you take that singular game out of the equation, the other 11 games in the regular season, teams converted 69% against New York's O-line. So it's just like one of those things you look at, and it is kind of baffling because like they obviously have, like, Ben Yacht has been a great 2-way player his entire career. Like Jack Williams has been a guy who's been a very capable defender. The Shartoks are guys who came up on the D line. Like they weren't O-line guys from day one. So you would think with that talent over there who has proven that they can play defense, that they would be fine on a turn. But for whatever reason, they just were not able to get it done after a turnover. And when you look at all of their losses, you look at how many opportunities they gave up. Because the thing is, they weren't even necessarily turning the disc over a lot. Like that game they lost to DC in the last week of the regular season, I think they only had like 13 or 14 turnovers, but they got crushed. And like you only turn the disc over 13 or 14 times, you might lose, but you usually aren't getting just beaten by a ton. But when you're they literally, they didn't get the disc back a single time. DC was perfect on break opportunities in that game. So like at that point, yeah, like 13 or 14, that's going to be way too much to overcome if you can't get it back. Kudos to Boston. Like they still had to go out there and do the thing, right? Like just because you're playing a team who hasn't been great in transition, they still exceeded like what they had been giving up all season. But like that, to me, that's like the real difference in the game. Boston was able to hold New York to only converting 6 out of 10 break opportunities, and Boston themselves converted all 7 out of 8, and there you go. There's the game.
I mean, to me, it's also the stat of Boston gets 14 turnovers out of New York on 12 blocks. New York just 7 takeaways. Boston with 12 total turnovers. Again, It just comes back to that institutional pressure that Boston has been able to apply on seemingly every opponent this season versus New York just kind of not having really any fire on the defensive side of the disc that we're used to. And I feel like I bring this up because they were such a contender last year and they're going to be hosting the Central Division title game, but we've sort of seen a similar dimming of the defensive intensity from Minnesota as well. And it's something that I worry about as they get set to host Madison on August 10th in that divisional title game. And we'll get to that in a second. But just, again, it's so perplexing how this New York team seemingly has enough pieces to cobble together a semblance of the greatness that they've been exuding the past couple of seasons. And yet you look at these end of the season team statistics and they are so far from the bar that they've been setting the past 2 seasons, especially. I mean, to your point about opponent defensive success rate, only the Phoenix are beneath the Empire this season as far as defensive break efficiency goes. I mean, the Mechanics and the Nitro and the Rush and the Havoc are better than the Empire this season. That's bizarre. That's
quite
absolutely like uncanny levels of kind of statistical analysis, right? Like, you couldn't even begin to prognosticate that if you entered into this 2024 season.
It does.
The New York offense is going to be worse than Detroit at giving up breaks for it.
And to your point about, like, you said they only had 2 games this season with 10 plus blocks compared to 12 out of their 15 last year. It really does give me the feel. And, I live in Indiana, obviously. I live in the Indianapolis area. It reminds me so much. It makes me kind of think that those Empire teams were kind of a lot like the old Indianapolis Colts, where they were so good on offense that on defense, the way that they were successful is like, hey, we already put up 21 points in the first quarter and a half, so we know you're going to throw the ball. We're just going to pin our ears back and rush you. And
the Dwight Freeney effect,
Dwight Freeney and Robert Mathis.
Yep.
They're just like pinning their ears back because they know you have to throw, and they just put that pressure on your offense to have to perform. And of course, there were very few teams that could compete in keeping up the scoring with the Colts in those days. It feels a lot like that. Maybe that's what was happening with this New York team, where they were so good on offense and so efficient in their offensive attack that it just constantly was putting pressure on opposing O-lines to have to just execute at what was probably an unattainable level for all but maybe a couple teams in the league. And then what happens? Well, defensively, you have this pressure that is being built actually by your O-line that is really enabling you as a defender to take advantage of that pressure that the opposing O-line is now under. Because a lot of those pieces on defense didn't change, right? Like, it's not like they had a full roster shift where, Babbitt and Osgar left. Okay, well, all these other guys left too. No, like, they have so many pieces that were great contributors on defense that just were not able to get to that same level this year. And it does make me wonder how much of that is due to the lack of efficiency. I shouldn't say lack of efficiency, but because they were fairly efficient, but like it wasn't the same, right? Like they were efficient in a way that was still pretty good, but they weren't able to be efficient and explosive in the way they were before, where it was just like doomsday. It felt like an atomic bomb was being dropped on you every time Ryan Osgar reared back for a huck. So there's just like that kind of circulates in my head, and I wonder how much that has to do with the lack of pressure.
Sure. I do think that there are compounding variables here, because I do feel like, as much as we've heralded the absences on offense for this New York team, I did notice towards the tail end of the season that they just had weirder matchups than I remember seeing them in their past 2 years as they won
Yeah.
titles. Like the opening score for Babbitt was getting open on a front cone cut against
Yep.
Angelo Ochese. And he's been great for this New York defense in the roles that he's provided. He's not suited to zone out Babbitt from the exact position that he wants to get in on every single point he's on the field. Like, that is a complete mismatch in the favor of Boston. Later in the game, I saw Bobby Elston being thrown on Babbitt. And it's, again, like, I understand you're putting some size on him. That's not going to work. You're not going to get a favorable result from putting a defender like that on the reigning MVP. And there was just a number of those instances where I looked at what the New York defense could offer against this Boston offense. And to your point about the Boston offense having some, I think, systemic conservatism, that I feel like they don't always punch as high as they could. You still can't really leverage a whole bunch of their one-on-ones. You talk about, let's just kind of run down what they have on offense. Like, it's Jeff Babbitt, it's Simon Carapella, it's Orion Cable, it's Ben Sadok, like Tyler Chan, like Tanner Johnson Go. Like, these are all very able one-on-one offensive producers. And outside of Antoine Davis, there wasn't really a New York defender in this game that I thought, yeah, they're going to go get a break against them. I know John Randolph played 16 points on defense, but it felt like he was kind of anchoring more offense. He was a little bit more offensively focused. It didn't feel like it was a big JR game as far as his coverage abilities. And there was just a lacking. And I think that bared out throughout the game. I know New York converted on a slightly higher amount of offensive possessions, but it felt like, for, again, its conservatism, Boston's offense got what it wanted and got the looks that it needed to in the moments that it had.
If there's a leverage point that I'm worried for Boston, like if they want to go into DC and win, what's the thing they need to avoid? They need to avoid Ben Sadok being 5 throwaways, 5 assists, right? He goes through these stretches where he looks like he can make where he's just on fire, right? There's a streakiness to Ben Sadok's game where for 6 or 7 minutes he looks like he's running the show, one of the best players on the field, and then you go the next 6 or 7 minutes and he's having trouble getting open in reset space. He's staring downfield too long. He's trying to throw that's maybe a little more difficult than he should be trying. And it kind of seems like there can be this streakiness to his game in either direction. And when they kind of struggled and New York kind of made their run, Ben Sadok was on one of those valleys. Like, he had come off the peak that he was on early in the game, entered the valley, and that's when New York kind of took off. They need to avoid that in this DC matchup because, DC, since, losing to Salt Lake, where we thought they looked good, but we were a little unsure of their ceiling. I mean, they've looked like one of arguably the best team in the league over the course of the season after that. Like, Atlanta's certainly earned their spot at the top of like your power rankings and certainly has earned the right to be called maybe the best team in the league. But the way DC finished the season, especially, it wasn't just winning games, it was winning them with absolute authority. Like, you got to go in there and play your cleanest game of the season because DC is on a heater right now that is like really scary. Like, they, to me right now, are the scariest team in the league, the way that they've just entered the postseason with such dominance. But if there's a team that can go kind of punch for punch with them, especially defensively, it's this Boston team. And so I'm so excited for this match. Like, I think all of these division championship matchups are going to be amazing. Like, I'm excited for every single one of them. I think across the board, these are the matchups that I wanted to see, like in each division going into it. That one, though, I mean, that one feels like, just chef's kiss. Like, I cannot wait to just sit down and just enjoy that.
Well, and here's just a couple of final thoughts as we depart from the East Division playoff picture for now. DC feels like the most dangerous team because they just had the arch nemesis that was always the monkey on their back and kind of the cap in the way of them making championship weekend eliminated. And as good as Boston looks, to your point, I currently have Atlanta at the top of my power rankings, but DC feels as deserving of that top spot, given what you were saying about their performances against elite teams over the past month. I mean, they dispatched New York by 4 goals. They beat Carolina by 12 at home. They've just sort of dealt with whatever pressure that has been thrown at them since they last lost a game on June 2nd to Boston by 1 goal at Boston.
Yep.
This DC team has lost 2 games by a combined 4 goals the entire season against prospective championship level opponents. So they have as good of a resume as any team within this league. Boston coming off of an absolutely historic win. I just, to your point, I also just revel in seeing this matchup. Like, I feel like it's going to be one of the better games that we get this entire season, and given that everything is kind of tilting in this way where we're getting the experience that I feel like we're always hyped on, it's so fulfilling. Like, that's what we just had in this entire first round, and I'm so excited to kind of get into these other 3 games because I feel like they have a similar texture as what we're just talking about with Boston and New York, where there's a juiciness this season, man. I know we've been always characterizing it as chaos and sort of an upheaval of the established order, obviously with New York coming into 2024 as the 2-time reigning champions, carrying a historic win streak. That was sort of what informed us coming into the season, and now it's just been completely turned on its head. That team is absolutely eliminated from playoff contention, and now we have this slate of Boston surging, DC surging, and transitioning to the result in the Central Division, this 9-4 Madison team running downhill at opponents, able to get defensive pressure seemingly whenever they need it, and winning now in double overtime, getting their 4th straight home win at Breese Stevens Field. Final home game for their coach in Tim DeBile. This Young Radicals team just overcame, in the same way that Boston did, a kind of emotional hurdle. They've been outside the postseason since they won a title in 2018 at home. They in the most bizarre cosmic way carry the longest postseason winning streak active currently, due to the fact that they won the 2018 title again and now won a double overtime game against Chicago. They put down this divisional rival that seemingly leapfrogged them within the division in the last couple of years. Chicago has won the Central Division title in 2022, or in 2021 and 2022. And yet the Radicals, in the ugliest game this weekend, I would say. I know that Seattle and Oakland exceeded it in total turnovers, but just the contours of the Central Division matchup were so odd.
Yes, to say the least.
And yet, they do it through defense. They do it through transition. They do it through this blend of young and old. They set everything up with the veterans making plays on the back end, and then sort of their younger players stepping up into these bigger roles and succeeding in the moments that they need them to. Again, I started this episode by talking about the kind of almost feeling of scripting this season. If you were going to write something for this Madison team, it feels like what's been happening in 2024, where they get this fantastic homestand, they're coasting into a Central Division title game against their rivals in Minnesota, and they just have all of this momentum. They have all of this energy. They're succeeding in the ways that they've been endeavoring to since they were last in the playoffs over half a decade ago. Like, this is what Madison is built on and what they're good at, and they're finally back in their zone.
They enter similar to like what we just mentioned about DC. They kind of entered the postseason on a heater, like just playing by far the best Frisbee they've been playing all season. You know, this game, we talked in the pre-show about this game, and I think you can kind of come away from this game with two very opposing ideas that are both right. And I think depending on your perspective or like what you want to see, that's what you're going to see. But on one hand, Madison played one of the ugliest games that they've played all year. I mean, the mental mistakes, right? And when it comes to like just dropping a disc that's like in your like right in your gut or very catchable disc, like those are generally speaking like, yeah, it looks like a physical, it's really like a mental mistake. It's a lack of focus and a lack of like kind of finishing the play. They had 4 like basically just like clap catch drops in this game, and 2 of them would have been for goals, and the other ones were just kind of you're kind of like, what is happening? And you could easily walk away from this game being like, man, this Madison team, they don't have what it takes. Like, they're just lucky that they won this game, and you know they're probably going to go into Minnesota and get their butts kicked. But there's like this other side of it where we've seen enough data, especially leading into the postseason, of how good this team can be, and even how good they were pretty much the whole first quarter until the drop at the end of that quarter, where you're like, wow, things went about as bad as they possibly could have gone for Madison. Like, they had this big lead. They had all the momentum. They completely choked it all away. They let Chicago get back in the game, take a 3-goal lead with just over 6 minutes left in the fourth quarter. And they were, despite everything that had gone wrong, that would have been the easiest time for any team to fold, for any team to just be like, the moment is too big for us. We're not ready. We're falling apart. It's over. And they didn't, though. Like, instead, they fight back, tie the game. They kind of look like things aren't going to go their way in the first overtime, and they're able to make it work. And they give themselves the chance to go into double overtime. And once they got there, they never let Chicago have the disc. Like, that level of like grit and fight and like mental toughness to fight through on a humid day where nothing seems to be going your way. You just seem to be making mistakes left and right, and to still be able to come out and win. There is a level on that side that shows me that this team is ready to go into Minnesota and compete. And I think like that can't be overlooked, because I think out of, 24 teams or whatever in this league, like, I don't know how many teams in that situation are able to come back and win that game. But I know Madison can, because they just did it. And to me, that was really impressive.
Yeah, that 14-11 deficit point was something that, I called the game live. I was there for it. And it wasn't until I was watching the film back that I really appreciated where this team's identity is coming from this season, because that's, to your point, absolutely where the Radicals would give up in previous seasons. Like, they just, through a mix of either injuries or veterans not quite being able to elevate to their former primetime levels, or younger players not being able to step up into the roles that maybe they're suited for, everything just kind of hit a weird arrhythmia or disharmony, where you would get these sort of cacophonous results at the end of games. I mean, it's interesting trying to talk about it with you, because you've kind of been on the other side of it a couple of times. I mean, in 2022, you guys got the buzzer beater at the end of regulation to effectively eliminate Madison from postseason contention with a 2-goal win. And it was so much representative of kind of the problems that I've been talking about plaguing this Madison team, where they try to meld these different elements and it doesn't always add up. And yet
Yeah.
that is not what happened on Sunday. Like, that is the absolute inverse. It's like every single time you could try to count them out, every single time you would look at the stats and be like, this is their worst game of the season, they would just rally back. They're down 3 goals with basically a half quarter left in their entire season. And they didn't seem phased in a way that I'm so used to seeing this Radicals team over the past couple of years since they won a title. Like, since they sort of retired out the veteran confidence class that carried a lot of their winning for several seasons. Like, this was sort of the true return of, oh my gosh, like, there's sort of a mystique to this team. Like, they'll just find a way. And I feel like the most, representative play of the entire night was the Sterling Kanaki interception in transition in the first overtime. It's tied up. Chicago has a chance to punch in basically the game-winning goal, and yet Union are marching in the opposite direction. It's absolutely downpouring cats and dogs. And of course, Sterling Kanaki rejuvenates himself back into, Kanaki Island mode, where he comes up with defensive plays when it matters. He gets a bookend score. I'm sorry, it was to tie the game at that point. Chicago could have taken a 2-goal lead with under a minute to play in the first overtime, and instead Kanaki gets the interception, ties it up, sends it to second overtime. Madison wins it. It just starts to feel a little bit, again, like this storybook thing where it's like, how does this home team come out of it in this way? Like, Chicago actually out executed Madison on offense too. The Union offense converted at a 57% rate, Madison at just a 47% rate. Like, there were so many ways in which Madison could have lost this game, and yet they just refused it.
They lost Pat Schreiwise in the first quarter. That's the other thing, right?
Thank you. And that was evident the entire night after they lost him.
Yes.
Like, their offensive stability came crashing down after he 100%. Got that ankle injury.
When you look at their worst offensive performances of the season, or like games that have a lot of turnovers, it's not surprising that they are games when Pat Schreiwise wasn't playing. Like, you look at their game up in Minnesota, you look at their game in Indy against us, those were Pat Schreiwise not being there. He is this calming, we talk about the term kind of like center handler, and like what that really means, I think, like when we say somebody is like a center handler, is typically speaking, and I think Andrew Roy is like the kind of apex of this, like he'd be at the top of this, the rankings of center handlers. It's not the guy who's throwing all the hucks. It's a lot of times not the guy who's finishing off the drive with an assist even. It's the guy that you trust to make the most throws at a high rate. And one of the best, you could make an argument for like the best center handler this league has seen, especially given the time period he played in this league and the way with which he was able to complete passes at such a high rate, was Andrew Brown. I mean, this was a guy that in 2014, back when, teams were lucky if their team completion percentage was above like 90% half the time, Andrew Brown was completing 98% of his passes back then, like at a time where that was unheard of. And that's who Pat is on this team right now. He's the guy you can get the distance. And for him to go out so early, not only does that put more pressure on your offense, because now somebody else is coming in who's not going to be able to fill those shoes the same way that Pat does, but now everyone has to shift rotations. You're down one player for the rest of the game. And in a game that goes to double overtime, where it's really hot and humid, there were multiple players cramping, and you're also doing this down a player, it was really at that moment where everything started to shift in the direction of Chicago. And again, that was one more thing that this Madison team could have used as like, oh my gosh, everything's against us. The sky is falling. And they just didn't let that be the excuse. They continued to fight through the Pat injury, the drops, the guys going off the field cramping, and they just found a way. Like this, much like Jeff Babbitt has felt inevitable for seasons now. Like this Madison team feels inevitable for me that they're going to find a way to win the game. Like they they've been playing the best ultimate in the Central Division over the last part of the season. They've looked like the strongest team. They've looked like the team with the highest ceiling. I think there are still those bumps. Like they still have a lot of inexperience on this team that's melded with some of those older guys with experience like Josh Wilson and Pat Schreiwise. But they have just this energy and this ability to go on runs that I think is just unmatched right now anywhere else in the league.
Yeah, I've got to concur with you. Another, again, like a low point for this team this season, or second lowest point, was their red zone efficiency, and yet Madison overcomes that. On the flip side, I also want to give some flowers to Chicago because they were down their team leading goal scorer in Wilson Matthews, who just absolutely unlocks a different level for the Union offense. He wasn't able to go in this game. He was questionable coming into it, wasn't able to be active. That feels like an absolute, contribution in a double overtime, single goal game. And in general, it just felt like, Chicago gets out to that slow start. They go down 5-2 in the first quarter, and yet they take that 14-11 lead into the fourth on the road. And even though they're not able to hold on to it, I feel like given where this Union franchise is, that's a big credit to Dave Woods, Sarah Nolik, and all the leadership and all the players on the Chicago team. Like it felt like last year in 2023, they backpedaled a bit into the postseason. They had a disappointing first round matchup against you guys in Indianapolis. And yet this year they've had a handful of, I feel like, really quality wins. They've really shown that they can punch up. And it was just kind of not what they could edge out as far as a more successful result. And again, they just kind of come out on the wrong end of a sudden death game. Like this isn't something that I feel like the margins can really be explained away in any kind of particular analysis that we give, other than like them's the shakes. Like this is just how sports goes sometimes, man. Like Madison got the opening pull in sudden death after Chicago received the first one in the first overtime, and that's basically the telltale sign of the game.
Yeah,
like Chicago I feel like had a really successful season in 2024.
Yeah, their biggest problem this year was just like the inconsistent play, because like we saw the ceiling like when they went into Minnesota and just absolutely punched them in the face. Like they looked like that version of Chicago could play with anyone in this league. But then we also see like what we saw in this game, which was a bit of like moments of looking pretty good and other moments of like they're just completely getting over their skis. And there was a moment that like we talk about the chaos season. There was like a chaos like point in this game where both teams were like trading turfed discs. And you mentioned on the broadcast, you and Colin, multiple times how humid it was, and it was very clear that like both teams were just like trying to play at this frenetic pace that humidity doesn't really allow. And for those who don't play in like super humid weather very often, your hands just are never dry. Like you can just never get them dry. And even after you wipe them off, it feels like 5 seconds later, they're wet again. And when you're playing in situations like that, you just can't move too quickly, especially if you want to move quickly with like a flick, because the disc will just slip right out of your hands. And we saw that happening with both teams, like trying to play so fast, but the conditions just weren't really allowing for it. And it became a little bit chaotic. And it was really for both teams. And you guys did a good job of pointing out on the broadcast, when Chicago started to make their comeback in the second quarter and start to kind of find some even footing, it was when they started to kind of slow down and stop trying to play so quickly. because for both teams, when they tried to go quick, that was when the mistakes really started to pop up. And when the teams were playing very intentionally, that was when both teams started to have some success. And I think that, I've never played in a super humid game up in Minnesota before, so I don't anticipate that they're going to be dealing with quite those same conditions, but it is something that maybe they should even keep their eyes on. Like, there's a difference between, playing with some sort of like urgency versus trying to play quicker than you're capable of doing and kind of getting over your skis a little bit. And when Madison's very intentional about what they're doing without feeling like they're rushing, that's when they're really at their most potent on both sides of the disc.
Madison comes up with 14 blocks against the Union in that win. It's their 11th game out of 13 this season where they've had double-digit takeaways, again, compared to the reigning champions, just 2 performances in such a manner in 2024. Radicals will now advance to face Minnesota on August 10th in the Central Division Championship game. We've still got 2 other first-round matchups to get to. I want to start with the Central Division matchup between Seattle and Oakland. Cascades getting their first playoff victory in 8 years at home, 23-19 over Oakland. Almost a wire-to-wire victory. Oakland taking an early lead, but Cascades coasting over the last 3+ quarters thanks to some fantastic play from their stars, particularly noted by Lucas Ambrose and Khalif El-Salam. Their defensive counterattacking efforts really propelling the Cascades at home. Cascades feel like one of the biggest wildcard teams entering into these final couple of weeks of the entire season. They clearly have starting line talent to compete with anybody, but as they showed once again against the Spiders, as they did against Colorado when it felt like they took a decisive lead early, they let teams back into games. Like this Oakland team struggled to produce red zone opportunities. They had just 10 in the entire game. They convert on just 7 of those for a 70% success rate within the final 20 yards of the field, well below the league average. And yet, because Oakland can connect on 13 of 15 huck looks against the Cascades, they can just punch up in a way where it once again brings in this question of, can West defenses really withstand the pressure of deeper postseason play? And I think it's something that both bears out a little bit of analysis in this first round matchup between the Spiders and the Cascades, as well as carrying over into what we can expect against Seattle and Salt Lake in the West Division Championship game in just under 2 weeks.
Yeah, this was a really, as every Oakland Spiders game is, especially, I feel like just a lot of turnovers. Like we talked about this before this season. It just feels like Oakland is always going to be involved in a high turnover game on both sides. By the way, Matthew Burke for Oakland, I know they lost, but he had 5 blocks in this game. He had 5 blocks all season. I thought that was kind of insane that he was just able to double his block total in this game. And there's that man again. Mama told me that man was scary. And Lucas Ambrose, man, Lucas Ambrose is an absolute cheat code. I swear.
He's different, man. He's just different. Did you see the block where he got the under block and just transitioned into the assist?
Yeah.
Where he scat marked he came into the lane, he kind of poached off of his specific matchup and sat in it for a second. He identified what the thrower was looking at, and then he manipulated the entire sequence by sort of scatting away from where he had been positioned and then immediately darting back into that space, picking off a pass, and then the exact same motion, dishing an assist. It's too easy. That's not a play people make in this sport. That's not something that people can just do. and it's sort of a video game almost manipulation.
His ability, like, I mean, in 2 years, just comes in, leads the league in blocks both years, and like, 4 blocks in this game. By the way, I gotta look. There can't be that many games where there's 3 different players that have 4+ blocks. Like Mikey O'Brien had 4 blocks in this game as well.
Talk about one of the most underrated offseason additions in the entire league. He's been
100%.
phenomenal for the Cascades this season.
Yeah, I mean, it was just, Seattle, like, every one of their games, and especially when Seattle and Oakland are together, like, there's always like just this energy and this kind of, it's just like fun. Like, that's the only way I can, because it is just, there is kind of like a freedom and a joy that gets played with out west between a lot of those teams that's like very different from what you see, especially like in the Central, where the Central can feel very grindy. It's a lot of like the defensive styles are just so different. Like, we got to play Colorado this year, and it's just so clear early in that game how uncomfortable they are with like constant double teaming, because it just doesn't really happen out in the West. Whereas in the Central, it feels like if you catch the disc and you're not facing a double team within 2 stalls, it's a miracle. And especially in Madison, like Madison was the first team to really like popularize that and make it something that was like a staple of their defense. And it's kind of matriculated all through the Central now. And then you go out west, and it's like there's almost never a double team unless it's like a planned one off of like a roller pole. So there's just so much opportunity to throw deep, and they take advantage of it out there. Like in the West, it really is like guns ablazing, but it is just so much fun. It's also the reason that you kind of get worried about these teams going to championship weekends. Like, that isn't always necessarily the recipe for success, but especially for Seattle, I mean, they have been so good in the deep game consistently. They've been the highest completion percentage deep team in the league pretty much since week 1. I think there was a brief time they were overtaken by Carolina early in the season, but they've been the most consistent deep throwing team in the league. And but on the flip side of that, they gave up 13 out of 15 huck attempts to Oakland, and just some ridiculous, I don't know how you got that catches from Raekwon Atkins. And it does give me a little bit of pause because I really like the Seattle team. I love the way they're able to generate blocks. I love the way they're able to be consistently successful in the deep game. But I do worry about their sometimes inability to stop the big play from opponents, especially when you're going against a team like Oakland that wants the big play. They do this every week. They want to throw deep as much as they possibly can, and when that that's the plan and you still have trouble stopping it, it does make me a little nervous. That being said, this Seattle team is so talented top to bottom and feels like they can get explosive plays from so many different people that I feel like they always have a fighting chance in any game that they're going to be a part of. And I don't think there's a team in the league that plays with more joy and just like zest for Frisbee than the Seattle Cascades. And it is really infectious when you watch it. It is hard for me to just not be smiling the entire time I'm watching them play.
They've certainly got a camaraderie that is singular in this league, and I agree with you that I'm hesitant in the same ways that you are. The sort of metrics that Oakland was able to succeed against Seattle at is something that I want to keep an eye on. But by the same token, I think that the Cascades also do things well in a way that indicates that they're a pretty elite team. You talk about two of the most successful break rate teams in the entire league. It's the Madison Radicals and the Seattle Cascades. And against Oakland, they were 9 of 13 on defensive break opportunities, 69%. You talk about their hucking success in the 2024 season, and yet they only attempt 7 deep balls against Oakland. They complete 5 of them for 71%, but they're not just seeking out big play opportunity. They're really trying to work it. I even think about the kind of seminal play at the beginning of the fourth quarter where Khalif El-Salam streaks into deep space and reels in a huck, gets an and one goal, and kind of pushes Seattle into an uncatchable territory in the latter stages of that game. Another statistic that I look at, Seattle 15 of 17 on red zone opportunities.
Yep.
Again, you contrast that to what I mentioned earlier in the segment, Oakland just having 10 total red zone looks. Like, the Seattle team is able to do the kind of, I think, meta successes that indicate to me that they're ready to compete on a larger stage. I know that we're not used to seeing them. They're the most inexperienced team in the entire playoff division at this point. But to your point, they have the stars to succeed. You talk about Khalif El-Salam, Lucas Ambrose, Tommy Lee. We talked about Mikey O'Brien a second ago. Tommy Lee had 2 fantastic toe down grabs in that fourth quarter to secure Seattle's lead. I mean, he's been an absolutely clutch performer for this Cascades team the entire season. He got their playoff clinching layout grab in week 10 against Colorado at home. Like, if he can continue that kind of level of play, Christian Foster continues to be arguably one of the best deep throwers in the league this year. Like, there are just elements to the Seattle team that I really like. And so I think that, kind of like they were in the last weekend of the regular season, they're going to be a problem against Salt Lake going into this West Division title game. Like, they fell down early against the Shred in week 13, but they clearly showed that they can battle back from kind of almost any emotional deficit. And I think that that's such a worthwhile characteristic to have going into, again, these later stages, these final 2-3 rounds of the entire UFA season.
Yeah, and Seattle's actually, like, if you just go by the numbers, like the offensive numbers especially, I mean, they have been outperforming Salt Lake this year, which is like a crazy thing to say because we were definitely expecting, and we've talked about this a few times, we were expecting the Cascades to be better this year. And, I had them as like the team I thought would grab the 3rd playoff spot. But to be converting, like, 2nd in the league in red zone conversion percentage, like, that was not something I was thinking I was going to say. To be ahead of, the Shred in offensive line conversion percentage, not something I thought I was going to be saying. Leading the league in huck percentage, another thing I did not think I was going to be saying. So, like, their metrics bear out that they are like one of the best teams in the league. And the thing is, you're right. Like, that Salt Lake game at the end of the season, it did feel at the beginning of that game like the moment was a little too big for them. They got off to an incredibly slow start. But really, I mean, over the last 3 quarters of the game, they looked like the better team in a lot of those instances. And they showed that they can go toe-to-toe with Salt Lake. Seeing what I've seen from this team this year, I feel like that was all the confidence they needed to say, like, hey, when we go back to Salt Lake after we beat Oakland, it's not going to be the same. Like, we're going to take that game. I feel like that's the vibe that's going on with that team right now, because that kind of fits in with how they've approached their whole season. Like, nothing has been too big for them the second time around. Like, they've had a couple of setbacks throughout the season, and they've bounced back the next opportunity they got. And I know I said I was like super excited for this DC Boston matchup. Like, probably the next one on my list is the Seattle Salt Lake one, because I think Salt Lake is obviously like the team who has the chance to go to championship weekend and be the host team there. And it seemed like a foregone conclusion early on in the season that was what was going to happen. And I really think like this Cascades team can do it. Like, I think the moment is not too big for them at this point. I think we're in for a truly epic showdown in a couple of weeks.
Well, and I think you talk about some of those numbers, the red zone conversion rate, the break rate, like sometimes, and I keep having Lauren Boyle, DC head coach's head or voice in my head about how some of these stats don't really matter. But like when you talk about Seattle's red zone conversion rate, and then you look at the film, like they've got Garrett Martin, they've got
Mm-hmm.
Zeppelin Ronig, they've got Khalif El Salam, they've got Tommy Lee, they've got Christian Foster. Like they have Lucas Ambrose converting these short range red zone opportunities on defense. Like this is a very sustainable attack for Seattle. I know it's like a relatively new revelation for them to be at this kind of level in terms of their success rates, but like you watch what they're doing and it's like, oh, they can do this against a lot of different opponents. I know that
Mm-hmm.
we're not used to seeing them do that, but they can. And to your point against how they performed at the beginning of that game against Salt Lake in their last matchup, it did feel like the moment overwhelmed them, but then also to your point, when they get that second chance, they don't miss it. And that feels like how they also approached this game against Oakland, where it was just like Oakland started to rally and then Seattle just put them back down again. Like there was no real hesitation in reasserting themselves. And that is absolutely a credit, I feel like, to both the coaching and just the player personnel right now, where they're able to understand that their ceiling is continuing to be defined by their next game. I feel like we haven't seen necessarily Seattle's best game in 2024.
Oh, I agree. I think they just continue to kind of raise the bar for themselves. Um, like every time they go out there. And the thing I love about them, and this is something I think truly tells you about a team's readiness to be a top performer in the league, is when you go against teams that you're clearly better than, what kind of results do you get? Are you skimming by or are you putting them down early? And they have all season, when they've played teams that are lower in the standings than them, like non-playoff teams, they've just crushed them. Like there's been no doubt in those games. And when they've played against, the better competition, those games have been close. Like their losses have, they don't have the blowout losses. They've competed in those games and in some situations won those games. And that's a sign of a team that is really good and that has the attitude even necessary to like go in and win a division title. And they just have dudes. Like we've talked about, like we were not expecting this team to be so strong, 1 to 20. And they have just proved, some guys we knew we could count on to go in there and perform. We knew Garrett Martin was going to have a great season. We knew Khalif and Jack Brown and, some of these other guys were going to perform. We knew Lucas Ambrose was going to come in and still be an elite defender and playmaker. But we didn't know like Mikey O'Brien was going to come in here and be as good as he was. We didn't know Aaron Wolf was going to come in and just be this steady piece that was going to be added to their O-line. And just,
He's so nice, man.
he's so
He's earned
good.
back. He's kind of got like a Fairfax ability to him, where he had a huge layout block in transition to earn the disc back for their offense, and just has like a gamer quality to him, where it's such a needed element to what that rounds out their lineups. Like we
Mhm.
talk about so much blending between veteran stability and younger playmaking. This Seattle team has that, and Wolf is such a linchpin in that. Like he is a perfect kind of cross point between those two ends. I feel like you talk about like the Zeppelin Ronigs, the Jack Brown, the Lucas Ambrose, almost the Jasper Deans, and then you kind of have like the Garrett Martin, the Khalif, the Christian Foster, the Tommy Lee,
When
and
you haven't
Aaron
even gotten
Wolf
to
is the
Mark
best.
Munoz or Dom Jacobs or any of these other guys, and it's
Ah,
just like,
on
isn't
and
it
on,
crazy?
man. On and on. Spencer Lofink this season has been such a good player for them. Like he seems to add a visible element whenever he can get into rhythm. They got Cedar Hines, Shane Worthington, Tony Goss has really emerged in his second season,
Mhm.
continues to make plays in the handler space for their defense. Like, yeah, man, like they're a fun team.
Yeah, it's the one, so like, I kind of mentioned with some of the other teams, like what's the area where they kind of need to watch out for? They're great in the red zone and they're great in the deep game. They kind of can get a similar problem that we kind of faced in Indy several times this year, which is those short field turnovers.
They speed up. They
Yeah.
can get sped up a bit.
Yeah, sometimes they get a little too sped up and they get these turnovers where like their whole offense is kind of running downhill and it's like they're all running towards the end zone and all of a sudden a turnover happens and then the counterattack is just like on top of them before they can even get their footing and change directions. But when they avoid those short field turnovers, it just kind of feels like defenses are pretty helpless against the arsenal that they're able to kind of go out there with. And we've said it, there's so much fun to watch. Like this is a team. This has quickly throughout the year become like the team I just enjoy watching the most. And I mean, for that reason alone, I really do kind of hope they punch their ticket to Champ Weekend, just because I want to keep watching just this kind of just the electricity they play with. It is really intoxicating.
Well, I want to see Salt Lake, I feel like, host Championship Weekend, but I can't really disagree with you because I do feel like the Cascades for the past 2 seasons really have been one of the most watchable franchises in the entire association. But I feel like we need to move on to the fourth and final game in the South Division from the first round of the playoffs. Carolina taking care of business at home, 26-18 against the Austin Soul. It was the third time in the past 3 seasons these two franchises have met in the postseason, each of them taking a game in the past 2 years. So the Flyers clinching this rubber matchup at home in week 14 of the 2024 season. And once again, it was done through a fantastic offensive effort. You talk about, I think, most exciting teams and most exciting matchups. I know that you're really excited to see what Seattle will do, to see what Boston will do against DC. We've got a 5th game in this calendar season of Carolina at Atlanta, not at Atlanta, but versus Atlanta, in 2024, with the Flyers securing this first round win. And with the way that Carolina is playing right now, they complete 10 plus hucks again. They once again just kind of like put the pressure and make a very good and athletic Soul defense play on their heels for 4 quarters. I really like where the Flyers are at right now, man. I know that Atlanta holds a 3-1 season series advantage against the Flyers, but there's still a little bit of the big brother matchup mindset in the back of my head with how Carolina traditionally handles their more southern rival in this historic matchup. The way that Tobias Brooks and Alan Laviolette and Elijah Long and Anders Jungst are playing for Carolina right now, like, I really think that this South Division Championship game that takes place on August 9th is going to be the feature of Divisional Championship Weekend. Like, this Carolina team feels still like a title team. The way that their defense can play in one-on-one matchups, the athleticism they have, the way that they can take the disc away with plays. You know, you talk about John Weller's their rookie. Seth Weaver is back from injury. They've got William Coffin playing at an elite level. Trevor Lynch has been spelling onto there. Like, this offense, again, is just completely loaded. Like, I don't know, man. Again, like, of all the wins in this first weekend of the playoffs, the Flyers had the most definitive one, and it feels like for as impressive as the Soul have been in 2024, this Flyers win feels like a real achievement and something that they can build momentum on going against Atlanta.
Yeah, this game was surprisingly close for a long time. I was really impressed. So one of the kind of unfortunate things that happened leading to this game is that Austin's flight was delayed. They got to the field late. Now, this was great for our viewing experience, because that meant that their game started right at the end of the Seattle Oakland game. So I didn't have to flip back and forth. I could just kind of focus on one game at a time, which was great for me as a viewer. But Evan Swiatek wasn't able to go in this game. But Austin really hung tough through 3 quarters. I mean, going into the fourth, they were only down 2. They were right there within striking distance. But then Carolina just really went pedal to the metal in that last quarter and really asserted their dominance. And, they won the last quarter 7-1. It was just like, if there was any doubt if Carolina was truly like the better team in this matchup going into that fourth quarter, they kind of put all that to the wayside. They still have one of the highest ceilings in this league. Tobias Brooks is playing out of his mind right now. It feels like
He's a freak, man. I'll just flat out say it.
He's had some catches recently where I'm like, so you have to deal with that guy and Fairfax right now, and it kind of feels a little unfair for the defense, because he's just on a heater right now. Where I feel like the last several weeks he's just been playing so well.
Can I interject there and tell you his stat line over the last 4 games?
This is going to be insane. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So he's had 5+ scores in each of his last 4 starts. Starting 4 games ago against Philly, he had 484 receiving yards, then 356 against Dallas, then 408 against Atlanta in the regular season finale, and then 388 against Austin this past weekend. Against Austin, he had 7 assists, 2 goals. Against Atlanta, he had 7 assists. Against Dallas, he had 3 assists, 4 goals. And against Philly, he had 2 assists, 3 goals. I mean, you talk about heaters. You talk about someone who I think is barely 20 years old, if he even is that. It's next, man. Like, you're watching the evolution of somebody who's taking over as a star in this league. To your point about, they've got to guard this guy as well as Jacob Fairfax, who is still taking care of business. I mean, he has a giant layout block in the second half of this game to effectively seal a big hold for the Carolina offense, and also has a couple other breakout plays in space, as he does every single game. Like, that's kind of my point leading into the segment. Like, Austin put up a good fight despite having every reason to kind of bow out in a way, and yet Carolina just put them down when it mattered.
Yeah, and their matchup coming up with Atlanta, the home teams won all 4 of those matchups. Carolina took care of business in the 2 home games at the beginning of the season. Atlanta really asserted their dominance in the 2 games at the end of the season. And this game is in Atlanta. I don't know how much the home fields actually played into it. I think Atlanta obviously early on in those first 3 games was not playing at near the level that they've been playing in the last 9 games. Maybe take the Dallas game out of that equation. But it feels like, Carolina would obviously love to have been hosting this game and had the bye this week. But ending on that fourth quarter where they really just outshone Austin in every way they could have, feels like about as good a momentum as they could get going into that Atlanta game. Like you said, this could end up being the premier matchup. We really haven't had this probably ever, or at least not in a long time, where it feels like all 4 division championship games are semi coin flips. I do certainly think there's something to be said for some of the teams being favored. Like DC, I think, is the favorite at home, just the way they've been playing. I would maybe give a slight edge to Atlanta, but like, you could convince me of any combination of winners for any of these games without me putting up too much of a fight, because it feels like we have just like 8 very worthy teams going into this last week of like divisional playoff games. And I can't recall it ever feeling like this in the past.
No, me neither. And we've been kind of building up to this the entire season. I mean, kind of dismounting from Carolina's performance, they just set a season low for turnovers against
Yeah,
Boston.
9.
Again, this is a sole team that led the entire league in break rate last year, was one of the best seasons in this league's history as far as converting breaks. I know that they fell off a bit in 2024, but they still have athletes to complicate offenses, and Carolina just kind of ran through them. Their defense converted on 75% of their break opportunities. There's 8 teams left, and I can't really tell you who's going to take it over the next 2 weekends of play. I mean, there's 7 total games left in the entire UFA calendar in 2024, and it feels like everyone's hot in a certain way or has a kind of momentum. There's no real sense of, I feel like, a favorite or who I would pick above the fray. It's kind of continued to be what it's been all season, which is who can take care of the matchup in front of them, who can stay healthy enough and figure out kind of a rotational matchup in a way that like favors their style, because there's real no sense of who has any kind of leverage within this 2024 season.
Yeah, I think the health point is a big one too for certain teams in particular. Like you look at Madison, like is Pat Strywise going to be back? Because
Oof, yeah.
that could be honestly the deciding factor in that game, because we saw, granted, it's a little different when you go into a game with a player and then lose them in mid game. Like you're not going to obviously be able to adjust as well because now you're down like to 19 instead of 20. All the ramifications of that. But, we saw in their games all season, they've looked markedly worse on offense without Pat Strywise on the field. And even going to their game up in Minnesota, where that was the Kai Marcus 11 turnover game. He's been much better since then, and has not had any games even approaching the 7 and the 11 turnover game that he had then. But, for all the strides he's made as a thrower, he's not the center handler, right? He's not the guy who you're just relying on to make, 50, 60 throws with that level of consistency. You look at Atlanta, who late in the season was missing Lucas McClamrock and Justin Burnett. Like, are they going to be ready to go? That those two pieces have been obvious, arguably their top 2 defenders this year. And
Salt Lake Shred have Kyle Weinberg. Will Selfridge has been
Mhm.
in and out of the lineup. Jordan Kerr is battling a broken hand and
Joe
coming back
Merrill's
from
out for the
that.
season.
Joe Merrill out for the season. Luke Jorgensen missed the last matchup against Seattle, which felt like a big contributing factor to how the Cascades got back into that game. Like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, there's just, I feel like, a lot of questions as to who can go and who can be available at this point in the season that just adds a further wrinkle and dimension to what we're talking about as far as this uncertainty, not only in like a general sense, but even just week to week is performance. So it's just,
Okay, I gotta interrupt you for a second because like it just kind of dawned on me. Isn't it crazy that we're having this conversation this way? Because if you think back into like most of the seasons of this league up to this point, in general, like a team was just better than another team. And if they were facing an injury, it didn't really feel like you would even talk about it because it was just like, well, team A is just better than team B, even if this person's gone. But I feel like we've gotten to a level in this league that there's so many good players, so many talented teams across the league that we've gotten to the point where we kind of have to break this down. Like I would hear like Mina Kimes break down an NFL game that's coming up where like, oh, well, this team's really missing one of their top edge rusher, and the way that changes the way they have to play defense and how that can affect the passing game for the opposing offense. Like,
well, absolutely. I mean, look at
it's
what
wild.
Chicago had to deal with without Wilson Matthews this past weekend. I feel like their inability to kind of stretch the field in the way that they wanted to, particularly in some of the set looks that they like to run, where they can stretch Sjogren on one rail and Matthews on another and just test your ability to then contain Lithia and Weiss and Shanahan in a middle space. Like, they couldn't do that at all against Madison. And so
Mm-hmm.
Madison had an ability to put a canopy on it. To your point, like yeah, when you're down, I'm emphasizing it and exaggerating it a bit, but like a Darrelle Revis, like a coverage specialist, like this, or somebody who can, add a different layer to your offense, like this really impacts how your team performs at this stage in the league, because
Yep.
there is such advanced coverages and game planning for how these teams approach everyone.
Yeah, and I think back to years past, like Madison's a great example of this. Kevin Brown was a guy who was an extremely talented player and was always really effective for them when he played, but he had so many injury issues that he would miss a lot of games here and there. And it was never like, oh, Kevin Brown's out, so Madison's going to really struggle. It was just like, Kevin Brown's out, but Madison's just still going to win because they're Madison. It was just like, those days are gone from this league. It really does like come down to the margins in so many of these games now where, if Atlanta goes into that game without a Lucas McClamrock or a Justin Burnett, like that, as good, like they won their last matchup without those guys, and they're certainly capable. But like, if that were to happen, we could look back at the end of the game and be like, man, think of what a world of difference on defense it would have made if they would have had one or both of those guys, and like that's where we're at in this league right now. And I think that's truly pretty cool. Like that's cool that the league has gotten to that point where the margins matter. It's not just about the big picture anymore. Like you got to look at like the fine details in some of these matchups and really parse through some of the minutia to even like figure out exactly why one team came out on top over the other.
Well, speaking of the big picture, we've got 8 teams remaining in the 2024 UFA season. We've got 4 divisional title games coming up on August 9th and 10th, just under 2 weeks away. Boston at DC, Madison at Minnesota, Seattle at Salt Lake, and Carolina at Atlanta, all coming up. Cameron and I will be wrapping up this first round playoff recap episode of Swing Pass, but we will be back in just a short bit to start previewing an absolutely exceptional divisional championship round in this fantastic 2024 UFA season. We are absolutely thrilled to participate and watch it alongside you, and we'll be back in just a short bit. Talk to you soon. Bye now.
Oh, he's getting the crowd going.
Are you kidding me? You are kidding me! Holy smokes!
Was there any doubt? Was there any doubt?
This is going to be the game. Joe Clutton battling for position. He tips it to the end zone where it's caught by Elijah Jaime at the